The year is 1429. The city of Orléans has been under siege for 7 months. The English are certain they are about to win. Their siege towers loom over the walls, and their longbowmen can hit a man's throat from 200 paces. Inside the city, people are eating boiled leather and the dust from the grain stores. They have no army to speak of. The French king, Charles VII, has all but given up. He sits in his court at Chinon, surrounded by advisors who whisper that the war is already lost. The English control the north, the east, and every major river crossing. Orléans is the last hinge holding the door shut. And then, in the middle of all this, a 17-year-old girl walks into the king's hall and tells him she has been sent by God. She is wearing a grey wool dress. She has never held a sword in her life. She is illiterate, can't tell a trebuchet from a battering ram, and admits she doesn't know how to ride a horse properly. The court laughs. The bishops roll their eyes. The king's mother-in-law, Joan of Aragon, is the only one who doesn't dismiss her outright. She leans in and asks the girl a quiet question. The girl's answer makes the room go silent. This is the moment historians love to fight over, because everything about Joan of Arc is a battlefield of competing stories. The Catholic Church made her a saint. The English burned her as a heretic. The French turned her into a symbol of national pride, then forgot about her for 400 years. But the textbooks leave out the dirt, the fear, and the sheer political desperation that actually put her at the front of an army. So, if you've ever sat through a history class wondering why they only tell you she heard voices and never mention the siege towers, the muddy fields, or the moment she took an arrow to the shoulder and kept fighting, you're about to get the real story. Because Joan wasn't a peasant girl who wandered into a war by accident. She was the product of a kingdom on the edge of collapse, a fractured church, and a woman who knew how to use a 17-year-old's faith as a weapon. Let's start at the hinge. The Siege of Orléans began in October of 1428. The English commander, the Earl of Salisbury, was a veteran of the 100 Years' War. He knew sieges. He knew that you don't starve a city out. You take the surrounding fortifications, block the supply lines, and let the defenders rot. And that's exactly what he did. The English built a ring of fortresses, called bastilles, around the city. They blocked the river with a chain of boats. No food went in. No messengers came out. Orléans had about 30,000 people inside its walls, and by February of 1429, the city was starving. Now, here's the part most people don't know. The French had a plan, but it was a bad one. They had a commander named Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orléans, a nickname he earned from being born illegitimate, from the Duke of Orléans. And it wasn't an insult. It was just his title. Dunois was a competent soldier. He knew he couldn't break the siege with force. The English had better positions, better archers, and a resupply line that ran straight through friendly territory. So Dunois did what any sensible commander does when he's outmatched. He waited. He waited for reinforcements. He waited for the English to make a mistake. He waited for winter to break. But winter didn't break. The Loire River froze. The English patrols tightened, and inside Orléans, the city council began drafting letters of surrender. So there you have it. Orléans drafting letters of surrender, the English tightening the noose, and a French command so desperate they're waiting for a miracle that isn't coming. If you want to see how a teenage girl with no military training walks into that nightmare and flips it upside down, subscribe. Because the real story is about to turn on its head. And while you're here, drop the word surrender in the comments if you thought that was the end of Orléans.
The defenses are weak.
That's when the first whispers reached Chinon. A girl in the village of Domrémy, on the eastern edge of France, had been having visions. Archangel Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. She said they spoke to her. They told her to go to the king, to raise the siege of Orléans, and to see Charles crowned at Rheims. Now, a lot of people claim divine visions when they want something. Usually it's land or power. or revenge against a neighbor. But Joan didn't ask for anything. She didn't want money. She didn't want a title. She just wanted to fight. That's suspicious. That's the kind of thing that makes powerful people nervous. Because if you can't be bribed, you can't be controlled. And a girl who couldn't be controlled was dangerous or useful. Yolande of Aragon, the Queen Mother, understood this immediately. She had been bankrolling Charles's war effort with her own money, and she was running out of patience. Charles was indecisive, depressed, and surrounded by sycophants. He needed a miracle. He needed something that would make his soldiers believe they could win. Joan walked into that room a complete unknown. She passed a private test. The king disguised himself among his courtiers, and she walked straight past them to kneel before him. That's the story anyway. The chroniclers love that detail. But the real test came in Poitiers, where a panel of theologians grilled her for 3 weeks. They asked about her voices, her intentions, her willingness to submit to the church. She answered every question with a clarity that left the scholars stammering. One bishop asked her, "If God wished to deliver France, why would he need a soldier?" Joan replied, "The knights will fight, and God will give the victory." She didn't claim to be a general. She didn't claim to be a saint. She claimed to be a messenger. And here's the thing. She passed. The panel declared her a good Catholic, free of heresy. The church gave her permission to fight. That's not divine intervention. That's a political green light. Charles got his miracle, and the church got plausible deniability if everything went wrong. So they gave her a horse. They gave her a suit of white armor, custom made. They gave her a sword. Not just any sword, but one they claimed was buried behind the altar in the church of St. Catherine de Fierbois. A relic, a symbol, and they gave her an escort of soldiers, including a knight named Jean d'Aulon and a squire named Louis de Comtes, men who would later testify at her trial under oath that she never used her sword to kill anyone. She carried it as a standard. Think about that. A war leader who never drew blood. A soldier who only inspired, never struck. How does that work? How does a 17-year-old girl, armed with a banner and a set of voices only she hears, walk into the most brutal siege of the century and turn it around? The answer is simpler than you think. Joan didn't win the Siege of Orléans with tactics. She didn't outthink the English. She out-crazed them. The English had been fighting for months. They were cold, tired, and bored. The defenders had been starving, freezing, and losing hope. Then one morning, a girl in shining armor rides up to the gates with 3,000 fresh soldiers and a banner that says, "Jesus and Mary." The English laughed at first. They shouted insults from the walls of their bastilles. They called her a camp follower, a witch, a whore. But Joan didn't flinch. She rode straight up to the English positions, planted her banner in the ground and waited. The English couldn't figure out what to do. They had rules of war. You besiege a city. You negotiate. You starve them out. You don't fight a girl in white armor who seems utterly unafraid to die. She attacked the Bastille of Saint-Lô first. Not the main fortification, but a small one, a church the English had fortified. Her soldiers hesitated. They had been beaten so many times. Joan grabbed a scaling ladder and started climbing. Her men followed, not because they believed in God, but because they couldn't let a teenage girl show more courage than they did. They took the Bastille in 2 hours. The next day, she attacked the main English fortification, the Bastille of the Augustins. She took an arrow to the shoulder. Her own men tried to pull her back. She ripped the arrow out herself, bandaged the wound, and went back up the ladder. That's not normal. That's not strategic genius. That's a complete break with human self-preservation. And the English, who had never seen a commander behave like that, started to crack. They had been told the French were cowards. They had been told the war was over. You just watched a teenage girl rip an arrow out of her own shoulder and go back up a ladder. That's not strategy. That's something the
While
manuals
the
don't
past is
cover.
contained within these pages,
If you want to keep uncovering
history is made
stories
through
where the
decisive
real
action
history
and
is more
unwavering
brutal and
determination,
fascinating than anything
even
your
when
teachers
wounded.
told you, subscribe. And drop a word in the comments. What do you call that moment when courage breaks an army's will? I'm calling it the arrow. And then the French burned the English siege tower. The great tower, painstakingly built over months, pushed up to the walls, the one weapon that could have broken the city. Joan led a sortie that destroyed it. The tower collapsed into the ditch, burning. The English commander, William de la Pole, pulled back. He abandoned the siege and retreated to the remaining bastilles. Orléans was relieved. Now, here's where the debunking needs to happen, because the textbooks make this sound like a pure miracle. Joan of Arc saved France in 9 days. That's the short version. But the real question is, why did the English retreat? They still had more soldiers. They still controlled the surrounding countryside. They could have regrouped, waited for reinforcements, and starved the city again. But they didn't. And the answer lies not in Joan's military brilliance, but in something much darker: the collapse of English morale. The 100 Years' War had been going on for nearly a century. English soldiers were fighting in a foreign country, far from home, for a king who was losing his mind. Henry VI of England was a child, and his regents were fighting each other for power. The English war effort was held together by a thread of veteran commanders, men like Salisbury, who had been killed by a cannon shot early in the siege. He was looking out a window, studying the city, when a French cannonball shattered the glass and took his face off. That changed everything. His replacement, the Earl of Suffolk, was less aggressive. He didn't want to risk a decisive battle. He wanted to hold the line. But Joan's attacks broke the line, and once a siege is broken, the momentum swings violently to the other side. The French, who had been losing for years, suddenly believed they could win. The English, who had been winning for years, suddenly believed they could lose. That psychological shift, more than any single battle, is what Joan achieved. She didn't just lift a siege. She broke a spell. She proved that the English could be beaten. And once that proof existed, every French noble who had been sitting on the sidelines, waiting to see how the war turned out, suddenly picked a side. But there's another layer to this story, and it's one the textbooks will never tell you. Joan's success was not just a matter of courage. It was a matter of timing, of politics, and of a piece of technology that had nothing to do with her. The French had cannons. Not many, not very good ones, but enough. And during the Siege of Orléans, the French gunners figured out something the English hadn't: how to aim them at the bastilles. The English siege towers were wood. The French cannons shot stone balls. When a stone ball hits a wooden tower at the right angle, the entire structure shudders. The men inside feel it. The tower starts to lean. Joan's attacks forced the English to concentrate their forces, which made them easier targets for the French artillery. That's the dirty secret of her victory. She was the sledgehammer, but the cannons were the chisel. And no one talks about the cannons, because a miraculous victory is more useful to a legend than a combined arms operation. The church wanted a saint. The king wanted a symbol. The people wanted a story they could believe in. And everyone got exactly what they needed, except Joan. The English didn't just lose Orléans. They lost their grip on the Loire Valley, the breadbasket of France. Over the next few months, Joan led a series of lightning campaigns that cleared the English from the river forts. She took Jargeau, Mont-sur-Loire, and Beaugency. Then came the decisive battle at Patay. The English tried to set up their classic defensive formation: stakes in the ground, long bowmen behind them, knights ready to countercharge. But the French cavalry hit them before they were ready, and the battle turned into a rout. It wasn't a fair fight. The English lost more than 2,000 men. The French lost fewer than 100. And Joan rode into the middle of the carnage, holding her banner, watching her prophecy come true. The road to Rheims was open. Charles VII was crowned King of France on July the 17th, 1429. Joan stood beside him, her banner unfurled, in the cathedral where every French king had been crowned for centuries. She had done exactly what she promised. Now, if the story ended there, she would be remembered as one of the most successful military commanders of the Middle Ages. But history doesn't end when the heroes win. It continues. And the next part is the one nobody wants to tell. Charles was crowned. The war was not over. The English still held Paris and most of the north. Joan wanted to press the attack. She wanted to march on Paris immediately and break the English hold on the capital, but Charles hesitated. He had what he wanted, a crown and a legend. Why risk it all on another battle? The nobles around him, the same ones who had been useless during the siege, now whispered that Joan was too dangerous, too uncontrollable, too successful. A girl who could lift a siege was useful. A girl who could capture a king's attention was a threat. So Charles stalled. He opened negotiations with the English. He ordered a truce. Joan, who had no official command and no authority of her own, was stuck. She could not fight without the king's permission, and the king had suddenly lost his nerve. She tried anyway. She led an assault on Paris in September. The attack failed. She was wounded again, this time in the leg with a crossbow bolt. Her men pulled her back. The French retreated, and the English held the city. Something broke in Joan after that. Not her faith, but her momentum. She had been moving at a constant forward tilt for months, and now the army was stalled. She was sent to fight minor skirmishes. The king disbanded her personal guard. The next spring, she rode to the aid of the town of Compiègne, which was under siege by the Burgundians, French allies of the English. She led a sortie, got cut off from the gates, and was captured. A Burgundian archer pulled her from her horse. She was sold to the English for 10,000 francs. 10,000 francs. That's the price of a hero sold by her own people. You've followed Joan from triumph to this gut punch. If you want to see how the trial turns into an execution that makes her immortal, subscribe now because the darkest part is just beginning. And in the comments, tell me one word. Either king, if you blame Charles for abandoning her, or cochon, if you blame the bishop. I need to know who this community holds responsible. The trial was a setup. Everyone knew it. The English wanted her dead, and they needed the church to do it legally. The presiding bishop, Pierre Cochon, was a political appointee who owed his position to the English. He packed the tribunal with pro-English clergy. They accused her of heresy, witchcraft, and wearing men's clothing. The trial transcript survives, and it is one of the most brutal documents of the Middle Ages. You can hear her exhaustion in the words. You can hear her confusion. They asked her why she wore armor. She said, "To defend myself." They asked if she was in a state of grace. She said, "If I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may God keep me there." Every answer was a knife, but they trapped her on the question of submission. Would she submit to the church? She said yes, she would submit to the Pope. But Pope Martin V was dead, and a new pope had not been elected. The church on earth was represented by her judges, the same men who wanted to burn her. She eventually signed a recantation. She was sentenced to life in prison. But the English weren't satisfied. They wanted a death. So they put men's clothes back in her cell, and when she put them on, because she had no other clothes, and because the guards had taken her dress, they declared her a relapse heretic. On May 30th, 1431, she was taken to the marketplace of Rouen, tied to a stake. The fire was lit. She asked for a cross, and an English soldier made one from a stick. She called out the name of Jesus as the flames rose. She was 19 years old. The English burned her twice until nothing was left, and scattered the ashes in the Seine so no one could collect relics. They thought that would end the legend. They thought that if they destroyed the body, they could destroy the idea. But the opposite happened. 20 years later, the French retook Rouen. Charles finally launched an investigation that overturned her conviction. She was declared innocent, and then, in 1920, she was canonized as a saint. The textbooks tell you she was a peasant girl who heard voices and saved France. The real story is messier, darker, and more human than that. She was a tool used by a desperate queen, a symbol manufactured by a failing king, a weapon that worked too well and had to be discarded. And the tragedy isn't that she died. The tragedy is that she was right. Her voices told her she would be captured. They told her she would suffer. She went anyway. She knew the end from the beginning, and she still climbed the ladder. That's not a legend. That's not a fairy tale. That is the kind of courage that makes you wonder what you would do if the walls closed in and the siege towers were at your gate. What would you believe in enough to die for, knowing you were going to die? The English burned the body, but they couldn't burn the question. It still hangs in the air, 500 years later, waiting for an answer. And if you're the type of person who sits through a history class and feels like there's more beneath the surface,
just like that,
you're not wrong.
Information is corrupted
The
by
textbooks
conflict.
leave out the mud, the politics, the fear and the cannons. But you already knew that. You came here because you want the version no one teaches. You want the real siege, the real sword, the real girl standing in the fire. And that story, the one hidden underneath the legend, is still being written. Because every generation finds its own Joan. Every war finds its own 17-year-old who refuses to stop climbing. True students of the blade, the question she asked the bishops of Poitiers is now yours. Do the knights fight? Or does the victory wait for someone brave enough to pick up the banner?